If you missed part one or just need a quick recap, we talked basically about all of our history from 1650 up through about World War I. So we covered quite a bit of ground. We know that Harbor Springs got its start as an Odawa village that was centered around Goodhart. It was called Waganakising, which is this first word you see right up here. Waganakising means it is bent or bent tree. The French, of course, took that and ran with it and created the term l'arbre croche, also meaning crooked tree. And then, of course, today we have it in English, Crooked Tree Breadworks, Crooked Tree Arts Center. So that's where that name comes from. Now, we also talked about how in 1829, there was increasing tensions with new European settlement in the area. There was the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Some Odawa chose to more closely align themselves with the Catholic Church in an effort to avoid removal. And that group split from the group at Goodhart and moved to Harbor Springs in 1829, a place they called Weequatonsin. So this is a different spelling of the Weequatonsin we know today. It means small bay place. And they founded Holy Childhood Church and built a school. And that's how Harbor Springs really got started in its current location. Now, really, Harbor Springs remained a small, primarily Odawa, small town. It was a fishing town, logging town. It wasn't called Little Traverse until 1861 when we got a post office and we were officially called Little Traverse. At about this time, you see the emergence of the logging industry in northern Michigan really beginning to explode. This is the 1870s or so. And about the same time in 1871, our area experiences a rapid explosion of settlement and expansion. Some of the treaty limitations had expired, and we had thousands and thousands of people flooding into the area. And it was at that time that our name officially changed to Harbor Springs. In 1881, we reincorporated as Harbor Springs in an effort to basically brand ourselves as a resort and tourist town. The name, of course, refers to our two best features, our deep natural harbor and the many artesian wells and springs that are in the area. Now, we've gotten all the way up to about 1881. In 1882, the railroad reaches us, which was a very big deal. A lot of specialty stores and other businessmen and entrepreneurs started to come into Harbor Springs with that track being completed to our area. And by the 1890s, Harbor Springs is an absolutely booming town. One of the statistics that has always blown me away is that at this time, there were as many as 5,000 people a day riding ferries, passenger ferries, just around the harbor on Little Traverse Bay, from Harbor Springs to Bayview, or from Petoskey to Harbor Point, Weequatonsin to Roaring Brook. 5,000 people a day. So we really were becoming a very large and important community. Some other things that begin to happen at this point, it's the beginning of the 20th century. It is a bold new world, you could say. The typewriter is invented. The Wright brothers have their first manned flight. In 1908, the Model T hits the market. Albert Einstein publishes his theory of relativity in 1905. I could really go on and on about the exciting things that were happening during this decade and during this century, I should say. I love this picture here. This is the 9 students who graduated from Harbor Springs High School in the class of 1900. Just gives you a little bit of a glimpse of what Harbor Springs might have looked like. And of course, we were continuing sort of on the same trajectory as we had been in the 1880s and the 1890s, this growing tourist and resort mecca. And town was a strong, thriving place developed to support both the summer markets and the year-round residents. There were new resort associations, there were new hotels. The mood is one of excitement and optimism. So here are just some pictures to give you a feel of what Harbor Springs was like at the turn of the last century, 1900 or so. This image is actually from Tom Graham's collection, and it is where the Pier restaurant is today. This is Abbott's Pavilion. This would be the main city dock right about there. And it's showing you one of the very large steamships that was coming into our harbor. Blessed as we are with a deep natural harbor, we had some very, very large steamships coming in from Chicago and Cleveland and areas like that, bringing hundreds of people every couple of days up to Harbor Springs. In Petoskey at this point, in about 1910 or so, there was a train arriving or leaving Petoskey every 15 minutes. So that gives you an idea of how much of a bustling place this was. And as I said, if we're filling up with visitors, we need places for them to stay. This is one of the hotels that developed during that time, the Kensington Hotel. It was built in 1881. It was the only 4-story hotel that we ever had here in downtown. It was one of the largest hotels in the area. It occupies the space where today's New York restaurant is. It actually took up the whole block. So the New York restaurant would have been more up front here in the yard area, and the hotel was placed back a bit. It went through many names, the Lake Park Hotel, the Kensington, and then eventually it was also known as the Dewey. You can maybe just barely make out that it says Hotel Dewey there on the cupola. And this is just one of the hotels that was in the area. I love this image. It was on the first slide. This is an image that we know is from 1889. And we know that because you can see the Kensington Hotel right here. And the Kensington Hotel, as I said, it was constructed in 1881, 1882. It burned down in the winter of 1889. And so we know this is before it burnt down. At the same time, over here in this corner, we have the Harbor Springs Depot, the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad Depot, which was built in 1889. So we can very strongly date this photo to the summer of 1889. We don't know exactly what was happening on the waterfront at this time to bring everybody out in droves. It might have been an early regatta. We're not really sure, but it gives you a feel of what the waterfront would have looked like. And this is another one of those examples. This is the waterfront again. You can see here is the New York where the Kensington was. After it burnt down, the New York Hotel opened in about 1904. It was opened by the Leahy brothers. You can't see it very well, but in this postcard, there's a building right here that's not on the screen. And that is actually the boathouse. It was started by Henry Melching in about 1900. You can kind of match up. So this is the depot behind it. And if you look at the depot's tower and the depot tower in this picture, you can kind of line them up a little bit. But that's what Harbor Springs looked like. Here's a little bit of a clearer image of the New York Hotel as it looked when it was first built. And it was a hotel at first. There was a bar and a restaurant there as well. At one point, there was a bowling alley and even a theater in that building. Today, of course, it is just the New York restaurant. Another fantastic image about 1910, a tug of war on Main Street. Again, we don't know what sort of celebration this was a part of. It might have been Memorial Day, 4th of July. There were a lot of different celebrations that the local newspapers mentioned. Another iconic building, downtown Harbor Springs, is the library building. It actually housed the post office at one point. The building itself was constructed in about 1906. It wasn't completed until 1908, but they broke ground quite a bit earlier than that. It was designed and built by an architect, a local architect named Earl Mead, who was very well known in the area. He built quite a few other buildings, including the high school, the Methodist Church, several of the different cottages in the resort areas, and was well known. So that building, again, iconic on Main Street. Directly across from it is another iconic building, the bank. William J. Clark built the 3-story brick building in about 1896 or so. It wasn't until 1905 that he obtained an actual bank charter from the state of Michigan, and the bank opened then under the name the Emmett County State Bank. And you can see just the beautiful facade there and how it looks today. This was the high school. I'm not sure if many of you have seen this image. The school was actually originally just this front portion. There had been a school on the bluff, this one in particular, from about 1877, and they kept enlarging it. So here they added a back portion, and then they added a whole nother wing. But eventually, by about 1915, they realized that school was too outdated. They couldn't keep just adding on stories to it. And Earl Mead designed another building. He designed the brick high school on the bluff, which of course is still there today. I love this image of a chemistry lab. That comes straight out of one of our Harbor Springs High School yearbooks of that time period. And the first yearbook we have is from 1915, and in it, our colors are orange and black. So some things have not changed. So we're switching gears a little bit now. As we entered into 1900, it was this exciting, optimistic era of booming resorts, and now things are turning considerably darker. 1917 and 1918, you get sort of a double whammy. You get hit with Spanish influenza and World War I. This is a picture of the train the day the boys left for World War I in Harbor Springs. So this is the train tracks right along Bay Street. Now, the US entered World War I on August 6, 1917, when Congress declared war. The Selective Service Act was also passed very shortly thereafter. All men between the ages of 21 and 30 had to sign up for the draft. These are two examples of local draft cards for two young people in our area, Reuben Hildebrandt and Stanley Hoover, registered for the draft. You can see that Reuben Hildebrandt here was a grocery clerk at the Harbor Springs Grocer Company, and Stanley Hoover was a garden laborer. I'm sure many of you know Hoover Flowers. That's that family. By the summer of about 1918, the U.S. had sent about 4 million military personnel were being mobilized, I should say. They were arriving in Europe at a rate of about 10,000 a day by the summer of 1918. Now, despite the fact that there was a draft, many men volunteered. Reuben Hildebrandt, for example, who we just saw on the last page, was a volunteer. You can see in this newspaper clipping that Reuben Hildebrandt of Harbor Springs has volunteered to join the colors ahead of his call number. And there were many other locals who did the same thing. Many recruits in our area were sent to Camp Custer to train. It's outside of Battle Creek, Michigan. And this is just a picture from Camp Custer. It's a human U.S. shield, had about 30,000 officers and men in that picture at Camp Custer. And you can see here, more boys leave to join the colors at Camp Custer. Emmett County selects the first increment of the second draft. Now, Camp Custer is going to be important again later, so just kind of keep that name in the back of your head. These are some items that the Historical Society has in our permanent collection from Reuben Hildebrandt. So this is him in his World War I uniform. And we actually have this coat and these, I'm not entirely sure what you call them, the leg guards, ankle guards. And we have these because if any of you know a lovely lady named Eleanor Jardine, also known as Muggs, Muggs is Reuben Hildebrandt's daughter. And so that's who donated those items to us. This is just another picture of Camp Custer to give you an idea of its size. It was so big that the panorama doesn't even fit on one screen. These line up together and you'll get an idea of how large that camp was. I love these. During the war years, there's sort of a regular column in the newspapers of the area called Letters from Our Boys. And it reprints letters, obviously, that were sent home from soldiers in Europe. They had to be very vague about what they were writing. It was heavily, heavily censored. So mostly they talk about the weather or the beautiful countryside, or they thank groups like the Red Cross for sending parcels from home. You can see some of these here. Harbor Springs boy in France. This is William Smith. It says the boys all got their housewives, and you can bet they come in handy. And then over here, this one, I love what this one says. Let me see if I can find the section in here. I would like to tell you all about our life over here, but of course, the most interesting part of our daily work we are not allowed to write about. Now, unfortunately, in World War I, there were many casualties, and two of them were from Harbor Springs. Stanley Hoover, whose draft card we saw, and Leo Smith were both killed in action. And the local American Legion post number 281 is called the Smith Hoover American Legion post, and it is named after these two boys who passed away. These newspaper clippings were very cutting to find. They're it's always very emotional. But just knowing the background of why the American Legion is named that was really a interesting fact for me. So this is another structure designed by Earl Mead. This is the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial and Well. It was built and designed about 1919 or so, and it was at the end of the war. There was a two-day event in August in 1920 where they put up a plaque honoring Leo Smith and Stanley Hoover. It might be this plaque, and it might be the one on the other side. Later, a plaque was added to recognize those who perished in World War II, and I can't remember which is on which side. But here you can see a newspaper article about the celebration in Zorn Park. There were many other soldiers from Petoskey and other areas of Emmett County who were involved in World War I. I'm just focusing on our two boys who passed away there. And World War I, of course, even on a small town, had a very large impact. Now, like I said, at the height of World War I, there is an absolutely lethal influenza virus erupting across the world. It begins, they believe, in an army camp in Kansas, and it moves east around with American troops, exploding at different camps, army camps throughout the country, and of course, eventually making its way on ships over to Europe as well. This is a fantastic book. If you haven't had a chance to read it, it's called The Great Influenza by John M. Barry. And it goes into all the specifics about how different this flu was. It really was devastating, something that we had never seen before. The first outbreak of the flu was in the spring of 1918. It was fairly mild. Those who caught it had typical symptoms, chills, fever, fatigue, but they usually recovered after a few days. However, of course, as this virus is spreading, it's mutating, it's becoming more violent, and the vast movements of troops back and forth across the Atlantic certainly didn't help. Unsanitary conditions in the trenches did not help. And the second wave of the flu, which hit in the fall of 1918, was much more severe. And as I mentioned, it broke out first in military camps across the United States, including Camp Custer, where many of our Michigan recruits were sent. Besides being extremely contagious, this version of the flu in 1918 in the fall that was much more violent, it caused victims to die within days of developing symptoms. Patients' skin turned blue, their lungs filled with so much fluid that they literally drowned. You can see here, this is an image of one of the influenza wards at Fort Riley, Kansas. And of course, Harbor Springs was affected by this. And how we were affected by it goes back to John Philip Sousa, actually. So John Philip Sousa was, of course, the composer of the Stars and Stripes Forever. He invented the sousaphone. In 1917, he joined the Navy at the age of 62 and started the Navy band at the Great Lakes Naval Station near Chicago. It was a 350-piece band. whose goal was to drum up support for the war, to sell Liberty bonds, to help with recruitment. And these, this large band, the 350-piece band, broke up into smaller, what they called Jackie bands that toured the country at different points. And one of those Jackie bands came to Harbor Springs. So this is a newspaper clipping right here about Jackie Band number 2, which is covering the Michigan counties. Now, they dine at Harbor Springs. And this leads to some unfortunate consequences. It's September 18th, 1918, when it is announced that the Sousa Band, the Jackie Band, is going to be performing in both Petoskey and Harbor Springs. A few days later, this is September 24th now, the newspaper reports that there are 4,500 cases of Spanish influenza at the Great Lakes Naval Station, where the Jackie Band had just come from. The very next day, the Jackie Band, who were on the next leg of their tour near Bay City, were stopped because of an outbreak of flu among its members, and were quarantined and sent back to Chicago. 2 days after that, Emmett County gets hit hard with Spanish influenza. You can see here just some of the articles that are in the papers at that time. These look eerily familiar, of course, to what we experienced in 2020 and 2021. By October, there's an article in the newspaper that talks about Emmett County having 2,000 people stricken and 3 dying. This article, Epidemic Takes 9 Petoskians, it's a very sad time. And it is directly traced back to the Jackie Band. The Dr. Nyhart at the time, who was treating many of the patients with Spanish influenza, treated one of the boys in the band, and then there were several girls who danced with those band members who fell ill almost immediately. And one of them actually did pass away. Emmett County Fair was shut down, schools were closing, churches were closing. I feel terrible for these people who were dealing with this onslaught of deadly disease in the middle of World War I. I just can't even imagine that. It's estimated that Spanish influenza infected more than 500 million people worldwide. By the War Department's count in the United States, influenza sickened 26% of the army, and it killed almost 30,000 troops before they even got to France. I could spend the entire lecture talking about this, but I'm not going to, because it's very heavy, and it is a fascinating topic, and did have a rather intense impact on our local history. But we're moving forward in time now, just a little bit. Well, first we're moving backwards, but then moving forwards to talk about Prohibition. So the fight for Prohibition really began in around the 1870s. There had been waves of sort of temperance fervor before that in the 1850s, and then again in the 1870s. It really took hold in 1874 with the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was an extremely influential group. Its second president was Frances Willard, who grew the group into the largest women's organization in the nation. This figure here, Carrie Nation, was a more radical figure fighting for Prohibition. She was a temperance advocate who favored shocking and elaborate displays, including destroying saloons with a hatchet. She was arrested more than 30 times and coined the phrase hatchetations to discuss her process of destroying saloons with her hatchet. And there were groups that sold little pins that had her hatchet on them. And bars would carry slogans that said things like, "All nations welcome except Carrie." Of course, the war effort had a huge impact on Prohibition and the fight for Prohibition. You can see in these 2 advertisements the main reasons why. Food will win the war, don't waste it. Turning grain into beer was seen as un-American and something that would hurt the war effort, as well as an all-out attack on German-owned breweries, saying that purchasing from a German brewery in America funneled money directly to the Kaiser and hurt the war effort as well. It's not particularly surprising then that between this sort of wave of, fervor by women's groups to promote, to cut down on the abuses of alcohol and create a more stable family life. You couple that with World War I and beer suddenly becoming un-American, and Prohibition seems a little bit inevitable. Prohibition is passed in 1913, but it turns out to be a little bit unenforceable. There are prohibition agents across the country trying to stem sort of this unprecedented tide of corruption that follows the passage of Prohibition. Gangs like the Purple Gang, run by the Bernstein brothers, you can see Abe Bernstein here, Al Capone, all of those were popping up around this time in direct response to Prohibition, becoming wealthy off of rum running and illegal brewing. The Purple Gang actually ended up being felt here in Harbor Springs, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But the Prohibition era in general represented sort of a loosening of rigidness and restrictions that had been brought about by World War I. So as you move into 1920, of course, you get this sort of Great Gatsby-esque feeling. There were flappers and cabarets and cocktail parties. And Harbor Springs was not exempt from that excitement either. Harbor Springs, according to local newspapers, both written in the 1920s and then looking back later, said that Harbor Springs was lousy with slot machines. So illegal gambling sort of went hand in hand with illegal drinking. There were an estimated 200 penny, nickel, and dime slot machines scattered just throughout Emmett County, in pool halls and dance clubs and restaurants. They were really only brought out during the summer resort season, Memorial Day to Labor Day, and then Labor Day they were pulled out and hidden again until the next summer season. Police generally looked the other way at these sort of local extravagances. As long as it wasn't organized by big crime families, the police generally tended to think that both gambling and liquor brought revenue, brought customers, and generated needed funds in the economy of Harbor Springs. And as long as it was kept in check, really didn't do too much to prevent it. You can see here, Jewelerettes is one of the places I wanted to talk about. The Jeweleret family came to Harbor Springs in 1895. They were actually fishermen by trade, but they rented a building right near the city dock and opened an ice cream parlor. Joe Jeweleret says he remembers this early parlor being really just a couple of planks that they laid across sawhorses and put a towel over. Later, the first soda fountain in northern Michigan came to Jeweleret's. The business was booming, it expanded. This picture here, I believe, is from about 1915, maybe edging up to 1920. Jeweleret's added dancing in 1921. There was quite a few notices sent to city council to try to get control of these dances because crowds were in the streets and making noise until 3 in the morning. And parents were not particularly happy about this. At Jeweleret's, guests could purchase what was called a setup, a bowl of ice and soda. You could get that for 50 cents. And it was a bring your own booze situation. So you just added whatever you wanted to your setup and went about your way. Now, Harbor Point, some of the families on Harbor Point were worried about their young, adult children spending too much time at places like Jeweleret's, and they built the Little Harbor Club as a way to try to bring their wayward children home. You can see here, this is an article from 1940, just showing a view of the Little Harbor Club, but it was started back much earlier than that in the 1920s. Now, I said we were going to come back to the Purple Gang, and one of the ways that we're doing that is with Club Manitou. So the Purple Gang, if you don't know much about them, we actually have a lecture about them that is on our YouTube page. if you want to check that out. But basically, they were a dominant gang in Detroit during the Prohibition era, got their rise sort of in the 1920s. They were violent and extremely powerful during the time that they were active. They handled all the alcohol smuggling for Al Capone, for example. And being right in Detroit, right next to the Detroit River, they really had a corner on the liquor market. Now, in 1929, there's a gentleman named Al Gerhardt who opens up this club, Club Manitou. Kind of looks like a rustic log cabin feeling resort. It was a 5-star restaurant. You can see it's, it doesn't look particularly upscale on the outside, but it really was on the inside. They had lobster that came in on the trains. They only hired French chefs. It was a 5-star establishment, and it was exclusively for resorters and tourists. They didn't particularly allow locals in. I'm not particularly sure why, not at first. And it's not until after Prohibition that the club really becomes less closed off. And Prohibition is repealed in 1933, so not too long after Club Manitou is built. Now, Gerhardt is an interesting figure. You can see him here in this picture. This is Al Gerhardt. He also went by the name Slim, and he became affiliated with the Purple Gang back in Detroit in the early 1920s, 1925 or so. And he was a driver for the Purple Gang, and he claimed that that's all he ever was a chauffeur. And he opened Club Manitou. He was a young man in his 20s when he opened Club Manitou. And, it's anybody's guess how he managed to get the money for this extravagant dinner club. But in this picture, you can see a gentleman named Sam or Fatty Bernstein, who was a cousin to one of the Bernstein brothers, I think through marriage. And it's really quite clear, if you know where to look, that Al Gerhardt was involved with the Purple Gang. And of course, there was much more than meets the eye to Club Manitou. On the surface, it was just a dinner club. But if you came outside, came to the back, and went down this back entrance, this back staircase, you got into Slim's Speakeasy. And this was a veritable fortress underneath that restaurant. So this entrance here, you come down these steps and you are met, once you get through the guard on the door and the gate, the iron gate on the door, you're met at the bottom by a sliding concrete door that's blocking you off as well. You can see over here in this map of what the basement area looks like, what Slim's looks like. You can see this entrance coming down, and you had two choices when you got to the entry. You could either come through this way into the entertainment room, past this glorious double-sided fireplace into the bar room, or if you were staff or employees, you could go through another sliding concrete door into the kitchen. I'm not sure why the kitchen needed such heavy security, but there are rumors there was an incinerator there for getting rid of evidence. You can also see in this image tunnels, several different tunnels going throughout the building. We don't have time to cover all of them or everything interesting about them. One of the tunnels went to a later addition to the building, which I'll show you in a picture in a moment. But apart from that one, there's another tunnel here that runs towards M119. And Club Manitou is located sort of across from the airport on Pleasant View as you're coming into town. And to get into that tunnel, you have to come through a doorway that is hidden by a bookcase into a storeroom that has a concrete door that's about 5 or 6 inches thick, into another storeroom, through another concrete door, and into the tunnel. This is what the basement looked like. Again, there's that beautiful double-sided fireplace. This is the bar room here and the bar. And this is some of the people who worked at Club Manitou. This is Paul Pepper on the very far right. He was the person you had to know to get down those steps initially. And of course, right behind them, you can see a slot machine, which I think is very appropriate. You can see here, this is the original Club Manitou building. It doesn't look as rustic anymore. But in about 1945, the club was doing so well, of course, this is well after Prohibition, that they constructed a whole new building. So this large, almost warehouse-like structure was constructed. And one of the tunnels, this one here, is connecting the lower level and kitchen of Slim's Speakeasy to this new structure. Now, Gerhardt is just a fascinating figure. In about the 1980s, he finally started talking to some of the local newspapers. And one of the things he said about the supposed raids that would happen at Club Manitou, he said, "You would burn the layouts. Aw, heck, you could dispose of almost anything." The club could handle about 350 patrons at a time. Eventually, however, Gerhardt and his crimes, which we don't have time to go into, but I will be speaking about at a different lecture in August, which I'll have more information about on our website. Eventually, the club was shut down. In 1952, the Liquor Control Commission revoked their liquor license and pretty much shut the club down. You can see here some of the different newspaper articles from around that time. Gerhardt is getting fined for violations of the Liquor Control Commission acts and for being guilty of having gambling connections to illegal gambling as well. Now, Club Manitou didn't sit empty for long. In about 1952 is when it closed. But in 1962, it reopened. It was completely reimagined from this sort of bar of ill repute, this speakeasy, into a teen and collegiate nightclub that only served sodas. And that was called Club Ponytail. You can see here in this image of what Club Manitou looked like in 1948, how the building has been slightly modified in 1962. And here's the Club Ponytail mascot up there. Club Ponytail was founded by Stan and Jean Douglas, who opened it as a teen dance center. They obviously were hoping to be a successful business and raise money, but they also wanted to provide sort of a safe and environment for teens to come and enjoy themselves. You can see here in this advertisement that it says, "Attention parents, this night will be well chaperoned and no one will be permitted to go in or out of the building." And of course, they only served sodas, as I mentioned. Although I did hear from several people who attended Club Ponytail back in the day that there was, I believe it was in the men's bathroom, the back of one of the toilets had been completely cleared out and filled with ice and beer. Club Ponytail was a fantastic venue that saw some of the greatest acts of that time period. The Beach Boys, the Supremes, Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye, Bob Singer. This poster here is for Dee Dee Sharp, Sam the Sham. All of them came and played at Club Ponytail. There was a large enclosed brick patio, 2 different stages, and the venue could draw crowds of about 2,500 at a time, which when the Beach Boys came, definitely was filled to capacity. Unfortunately, as with all great things, it came to an end much too quickly. On March 18th, 1969, there was a large fire that completely destroyed the club. Local firemen think that maybe fumes from a gas furnace caused the explosion that demolished the club, but no one really knows for sure. The Douglas family said that they would rebuild Club Ponytail, but it never did. It never did come back. The patio, which you can see here, and the original Club Manitou, which was this building right here on the right, those still remain. Now, jumping back in time a little bit, we got to the 1960s with Club Ponytail. Jumping back to the era of the 1930s and the 40s, right after the end of Prohibition, I wanted to touch just briefly on some other things that were happening in Harbor Springs at that time, specifically the Ottawa naming ceremonies of the 1930s. These were conducted by the Michigan Indian Defense Association, which was a group that every year would choose one white person to honor with a traditional Anishinaabe name, an Odawa name, usually for their support and work with the Odawa community. Some of the honorees include Alice Irwin, who was a local author and conservationist, Judge Palethorpe, E.J. Hanna, who was one of the publishers of the Emmett County Graphic newspaper, just quite a few different people. They didn't hold any ceremonies during World War II, but they did come back up after that. This gentleman here, Fred Edwigeshik, who was Frank Edwigeshik's father, was very much involved in the Michigan Indian Defense Association and was very much involved in the naming ceremonies themselves. Now, about 1947, there's another organization found called the Michigan Indian Foundation, or the Ottawa Indian Foundation. And this is a native-run group. I'm sorry, the Michigan Indian Defense Association, similar names. The earlier association was Odawa-led. The new association was created by several rather wealthy resorters with the same goal, to preserve and promote Odawa culture, but also to drive tourism to the community. The group that formed in 1947, newspapers mentioned that they talked about how Traverse City had a cherry festival and Charlevoix had a Venetian festival, and Harbor Springs needed to have something like that. So the two groups partnered together. The Odawa-led group and the Ottawa Indian Foundation partnered together to create the Ottawa Indian Pageant and Naming Ceremony. So it grew to be an extremely large event. The first ceremony in 1947 drew nearly 4,000 people to Harbor Springs. In order to have more spectators attend, the Michigan Indian Foundation built Ottawa Stadium. This is an early view of Ottawa Stadium that you see there. Now, the foundation also sponsored the purchase of Andrew J. Blackbird's home. Blackbird's home is the oldest surviving structure in Harbor Springs. As far as we know, it is from 1858, and it was purchased back in the late 1940s, 1948, I believe it says here, specifically to be turned into a museum. You can see here they're talking about rehabilitation plans. This was also one of Harbor Springs's first post offices. And so it's a very important building in our history for a number of reasons. The museum changed hands multiple times. It is currently owned and operated by the city of Harbor Springs, not the Historical Society. Now, one of the other things that sort of happened around this time, the pageants and naming ceremonies just continued to evolve and morph into, just a variation on the same theme. There were traditional dances and songs and plays. The play of Hiawatha, for example, was one that happened quite a bit. It is a dramatization of Longfellow's poem of the same name. If Hiawatha sounds familiar to you, I didn't cover it, but between 1905 and 1915, on Round Lake, there was a Hiawatha pageant sponsored by the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railway. Coincidentally, that is one of the topics I talk about in a new exhibit that is opening at the Harbor Springs History Museum in the next couple of weeks. Should be open by June 1st at the absolute latest. And it is all about the foundation of the resort communities from 1870 to 1900. But I budge a little bit outside of that time zone to talk about the original Hiawatha pageants. But back to where we were. This ceremonies, they continued into the 1960s. I had to include this picture. This is my husband's uncle, Richard, as a 10-year-old boy playing Hiawatha. I just love that image. Now, it's not until about 1992 that this sort of ceremony and play turns into the first annual Odawa Homecoming Powwow that is still held every year. here in our community. Let's see. All right, I still have a few more minutes. I've got like 4 more slides. We're going to cover it real fast. Obviously, I don't want to skip over World War II. It is just as impactful of a time as World War I. It was slightly less intensely censored, so there are more letters from soldiers across the world who were stationed in various places in Africa and in Europe, coming home. This is Richard Wemegwas, my husband's uncle again. He's no longer 10 years old. As you can see, he's grown quite a bit. Making history personal like this and finding these connections is one of the things I love about local history. You can see here just some other articles about World War II, I'm sorry, in Harbor Springs. This one, for example, is asking everyone to pick milkweed pods that are used in life jackets. Post-World War II, things are sort of changing a little bit. Obviously, we are still a heavily tourist and resort frequented area, but it's a little bit of a different craze from the early 1890s and 1900s when I was talking about sort of those first groups coming up. Those first groups that came up and were founding those resorts, they needed to stay someplace while they built their cottage or while they were visiting to decide if Harbor Springs was a place they wanted to stay. And so most resorts had hotels. Harbor Point, Roaring Brook, Wequitansing, all of them had different hotels. And unfortunately, in the post-World War II era, these hotels sort of fell into disuse. Most of the people who wanted to come up here had cottages, and or the resorts themselves just weren't needing them anymore. There were plenty of other hotels in the area. So the Harbor Point Clubhouse, it was torn down in 1963. The Wequitansing Hotel came down in 1967. And the Roaring Brook Inn actually burnt to the ground in 1954, I believe it was. A quick shout out, if you'd like to learn more about sort of this period in the 1960s, the Civil Rights Act, and about the Rainbow Inn, which was the only African-American owned and operated hotel in Petoskey and in our area. We have a video about that on our YouTube page. So again, check out our YouTube. Now, the resort season as we know it was expanding from the times when it was just summer traffic coming up. In the 1950s, we see Harbor Springs becoming a winter ski destination. In 1957, Dory and Nub Sarns viewed the hill that would become Nub's Knob for the first time. After a lot of tree cutting, lodge construction, installing chairlifts, it finally snowed and Nub's Knob opened on January 18th, 1959. It only had 3 trails and 1 double chairlift, and a weekend lift ticket was $5. You can see some of those images here of an early Nub's Knob. Now, by 1978, Nub's had 16 slopes, 4 chairlifts, and the research and development into their patented snowmaking guns had begun. And across the way, we had Harbor Highlands, which was Boyne Highlands, and now is maybe just the Highlands. But Harbor Highlands was founded in 1955. It was just one hill with a single rope tow and an old schoolhouse that had been converted into a warming hut. Eventually, that resort was purchased by Everett Kircher, Boyne, USA in the 1960s, and Boyne Highlands officially opened in 1963. And it had the first triple chairlift in the world. So this is a postcard, Harbor Springs in the 1960s or 70s. We have covered so many topics in a brief amount of time, and I'm happy to take questions if you have any, or if you have suggestions for a part 3. of the history of Harbor Springs. Really, there is such rich and deep heritage and history here that I could talk at length about many, many different topics. But I encourage you to do some research on your own, to visit the museum, of course. We are open Tuesdays through Saturdays from 10 to 4 all year round. And I mentioned we will have a new exhibit opening soon as well. We would love to see you at the museum.